Well, hello everyone. My name is Harvey Weiner, and I want to thank Home Front Strong for allowing me and other veterans to tell their stories. As all veterans know, non-veterans, even family and friends, are generally not that interested in veteran stories. And even if they are, or pretend to be, they can never truly understand. I also want to apologize for using notes in reading, but at age 83, I do need these to tell you a coherent and complete story. Although 70 may be considered the new 60, I have concluded that 80 is still 80. Now, I was born in a three-decker in Mattapan, Massachusetts, and was raised in Mattapan and Hyde Park. My father was a factory worker, and my mother a civil service clerk for Veteran Services in Boston. I did, however, get a good education. I served in Vietnam as an Army officer from May 16, 1969 to May 16, 1970. I had taken a college Army ROTC and went on active duty as an intelligence officer. After basic training at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, basic officers infantry training at Fort Benning, Georgia, and intelligence, Southeast Asia, and Vietnamese language training at Fort Holabird, Maryland, I was sent to South Vietnam, although frankly, I did not want to go there. I was opposed to the war, and I was married at the time, but I wasn't a conscientious objector, and I had signed up, so I went. My late father took some poignant pictures of my wife and I just prior to our departure at the airport. This is my wife and I at Logan Airport as I'm leaving, and neither of us are very happy about it. By the way, this is what I looked like then when I was young and handsome, although there was much less of me then than there is now. In South Vietnam, I was assigned to province headquarters in the little village of Vitan in Trung Tien province. And if you look at the map behind me, you'll see that Vietnam is shaped like a S-shaped rattlesnake with its head up in the air. And Vitan is right at the bottom of the rattle of the tail of the rattlesnake. There are 44 provinces in Vietnam, and the average province is much smaller than Rhode Island. In fact, all of South Vietnam is about the size of New Mexico in the United States. Now, the province of Trung Tien was so remote that it doesn't exist anymore. The communist government, when it took over, eliminated it completely, and I say good riddance to that. It was comprised mainly of rice paddies and some jungle, and it contained part of the infamous U Minh forest, where, according to the late historian Bernard Fall, thousands of French paratroopers parachuted into it during the 1950s and were never heard from again. The Viet Cong had held American prisoners there, but not while I was there. In fact, the forest, the U Minh forest in my whole province, was covered with Agent Orange when I was there. Now, Vietnam has 2 seasons per year. Hot dry, when I tell you a camel would die of thirst. And hot wet, when the monsoons are so thick that when you stood out in them, you couldn't see a hand in front of your face. And I tried that. My province of Trung Tien was either the province in the country that was most controlled by the Viet Cong, or the province second most controlled by the Viet Cong. It would flip-flop statistically with the neighboring province each month as being the first or second most Viet Cong controlled. It was about 60 to 70% Viet Cong controlled, and that's just during the day. It was known as a Viet Cong rest and recreation area. Being VC controlled is different than being the most dangerous province, which it clearly was not. The most dangerous provinces were up in I Corps. Now, I lived mainly at our province compound with about 40 other military and civilian Americans, each assigned as advisors to the Vietnamese during the so-called Vietnamization of the war effort. There were no American regular units stationed in our province, and in fact, there were no regular South Vietnamese line unit stationed in our province. I was first the Deputy Phoenix Coordinator and then the Phoenix Coordinator for the province. My direct superior at 4 Corps headquarters was the legendary John Paul Vann, and his direct supervisor in Saigon was Ambassador William Colby. Here is a book called A Bright Shining Lie, John Paul Vann and America in Vietnam by Neil Sheehan. It won the Pulitzer Prize, and it tells you all you want to know about the legendary John Paul Vann. Now, I was attached to 2 separate local South Vietnamese provincial operational units. The first was a province police tactical unit, and my South Vietnamese counterpart was the province police commissioner. The second unit was my Phoenix program, or Phung Nguyen program in Vietnamese, in which my South Vietnamese counterpart ran tactical intelligence, gathering, and operational units. The operational unit was called the Provincial Reconnaissance Unit, or the PRUs, the PRUs. And the PRUs were really the best and most feared fighters in our province. They were really good. During the dry season, they were jokingly known as Weiner's Raiders. And during the wet season, they were known as Weiner's Waders. What is the Phoenix mission? Our Phoenix mission was to identify the province Viet Cong infrastructure, the infamous VCI, that is the civilian communists whose shadow government tried to run the country in secret. We would identify them and try to neutralize them, such as by arrest, by convincing them to change sides to our sides as part of the Chu Hoi program, or as a last resort by combat, as many of them wore 2 hats, military and civilian. Sometimes we would recruit them as double agents. We would go out on small-scale operations based on fresh intelligence to capture members of the VCI. Guerrilla wars are a different breed of war. And in Vietnam, the war was different in each province and indeed in each district, which was a subdivision of a province. In fact, the war is really different for each combatant. Now, the definitive book on the Phoenix program is entitled Phoenix and Birds of Prey by Mark Moyer, M-O-Y-E-R. There's a second edition of this book. This is the first edition, and I was interviewed for this edition. Mark Moyer was a college classmate of our son, and the genesis of this book was his senior thesis. So sometimes college senior thesis can be useful. Now, I'll give you an operational example of what we did in the Phoenix program, at least in our province, my province. One day, we had received fresh intelligence from a defector that a key VCI leader that we'd been looking for years was staying in a hooch, or a hut, for a night about 2 miles from our compound. Now, after convincing my Phung Nguyen counterpart to go out on the operation, even though it was a Vietnamese holiday, about 6 of us went out on foot to get him. Tu Ta was the target's nom de guerre. We had to advance mainly through Viet Cong-controlled territory. My interpreter and I stationed ourselves at a canal near the hooch to prevent people coming up the canal to warn him, while the other force surrounded the hooch. To my dismay, a few boats came up the canal with a dozen Vietnamese civilians who were probably Viet Cong sympathizers, or probably maybe even Viet Cong, and I had to detain them for the duration of the mission. The other 4 captured Tu Ta, our target, and we brought him back to province headquarters. As an ununiformed civilian, he was not entitled to the protections of the Geneva Convention, and he came under civilian police authority. Now, my year in Vietnam was one of transition after the early 1968 Tet Offensive. Now, North Vietnamese regulars were infiltrating into South Vietnam, including into my province, to the displeasure of the less sophisticated indigenous rural Viet Cong. I spoke with a few Viet Cong defectors who defected after the North Vietnamese came into the province. They told me they resented and hated the arrogant, urban North Vietnamese and defected accordingly. Now, my year in Vietnam did not pass quickly, but at least I knew the exact date beyond which come home. Our tours were 1 year. We could sign up for more, but they were only 1 year, and that knowledge made a big difference in everybody's morale. I don't know how soldiers in other wars handle the uncertainty of their tours, which could and did last for many years. At least now there is a support system for the families, which didn't exist when I was at war, and my wife suffered alone and in silence. Now, this is the photo of my wife, which hung over my bunk in my hooch the entire year I was there. Now, two experiences I had in Vietnam helped shape my views of war and of life. Now, the first one exemplified for me the absolute evil of war. One day, the S2 intelligence province advisor, an American who advised the Vietnamese military intelligence officer in the province, he showed me an 18-inch wooden and wire head cage, sort of a mini tiger cage. It had been captured from the Viet Cong, who, he said, used it to torture prisoners. The cage would be put over the head of a prisoner, and a hungry rat would be placed inside the cage. The S2 advisor said to me that the eyes of the prisoner were eaten first by the rat. Does war make people this evil, or is it in us innately, with war as the catalyst that brings the evil out, the release of the infamous dogs of war? The second experience I had is about luck and karma, a quirk of fate that I was not killed. In early 1970, we got word back at the province level that a large Viet Cong weapons cache had been captured in our province. Larry Hickey, an American civilian from the National Intelligence Agency, was visiting at the time, and our province senior advisor wanted to show him the discovery. So we set out in two Jeeps, about 10 of us, 5 in each Jeep. Larry and I and 3 Americans were in the lead Jeep, which was my Jeep, when my sergeant driver just missed a left turn on a side road where the weapons cache was located. The second Jeep, which was behind us and which contained our Vietnamese counterpart, correctly turned left. We saw that in our rearview mirror, that the Jeep had turned, so we stopped, backed up, and made the same left turn and followed the second Jeep. The second Jeep was first now, but we intended to catch up and pass it. Now, within a couple of minutes, that new Jeep hit a landmine, killing or wounding almost everyone in the Jeep, including the Vietnamese assistant coordinator, one of my counterparts, who died in my arms. What if my Jeep had not inadvertently missed that turn and we had been first? Now, I still have a piece of shrapnel in that landmine and photos of the incident. The shrapnel is presently part of an exhibit on Jews in Vietnam in the National Museum of American Jewish Military History in Washington, D.C. I do have the photos here with me, though. This is a photo of we're just starting out, and you will see Larry Hickey in civilian clothes and the province senior advisor, and I am smiling to the camera. Do not know who took the picture. In this book are Larry Hickey's photos of the incident. This is the instant in which the Jeep in front of us blew up. This is me right here with my counterpart on the ground, in which he died in my arms. And these were photos with a film camera, and there was a snap of the shutter when this picture was taken by Larry Hickey. And when I heard that snap, my instinct was it's a Viet Cong, and I shot him with my M16. I won't go through each of these. People were medevaced out, but in the end, this is a photo of my negligent sergeant driver who missed that turn, thank God for me, and some of the bodies he's taking back to province headquarters. Now, I do not remember clearly my return to the USA from Vietnam in 1970. I do remember flying out of Vietnam without looking back, flying to 4 Corps headquarters in Can Tho, and then going to Saigon, where I became extremely ill with the flu. I mainly slept through the long flight from Saigon to San Francisco. When I then went to the civilian air terminal in the San Francisco airport, I kept my uniform on because I could get a military discount on a civilian flight from San Francisco to the East Coast but only if I wore my uniform. Now, as I approached the airline counter to buy my ticket, I ran smack into an anti-war demonstration. And a woman ran up to me, spit at me, she missed by the way, and yelled something like, "Baby killer." I was too ill to respond. I bought my ticket at the discount, boarded the plane, and returned home, where I spent the next week in bed sick. Unexpected, expectatory greeting upon my returning home, among other reasons, caused me to hunker down for about 30 years and barely mention my time in Vietnam to anyone. In fact, I basically hid it. I thought nothing good would ever come out of my war experiences. However, events unfolded such that this repression was not permanent, and in fact, my war experiences had some positive ramifications decades later. Over 30 years after I returned, 9/11 happened, and I sensed that another unpopular war was on the way. I wanted Americans to separate war from the warriors and their families, and they had not done when I was a soldier. As I indicated, my wife had been ridiculed and harassed when I was at war, and I received no support from anyone other than my family. After 9/11 happened, I joined several veterans groups, something I never expected to do, as I hope to make a difference in this regard, having America separate the war from the soldiers and their families. But fortunately, there was really no need to be involved in that issue at all. Because there was no draft, the distinction that I had made was made. Oppose the war, but support the warrior was one sign I saw at an anti-war demonstration, and it was true. So in the year 2005, I attended the annual convention in San Diego of the Jewish War Veterans of America, one of the veterans associations I had joined. I really wasn't that active. I had a free evening, so I went to see A Winter's Tale at the San Diego Shakespeare Festival in Balboa Park. I sat next to a man and a woman who struck up a conversation with me and asked why was I in San Diego. I told her that I was attending a convention of the Jewish war veterans, and she replied, "I didn't know there were any." At that moment, I had an epiphany, and now I had a purpose for being in a veterans organization, to show others that Jewish Americans had served the country in the military. So let me tell you about the Jewish War Veterans of America, JWV. It's an organization that's over 129 years old. It was founded in 1896 and is the oldest continuous veterans organization in the United States. It is older than the American Legion, older than the veterans of foreign wars, older than all of them. It does many good and charitable things, but what really sets it apart as a separate organization is that it has the unique mission to affirm Jewish service in America's armed forces in all of America's conflicts. So it was essentially for that reason that I became very active in it. And this is my I became national commander in 2019, 2020, and this is my national commander's cap. So Jews, as a community, have been in this country for over 370 years, and Jews have been willing to fight for this country right from the beginning. In fact, before the beginning of the country. Over 370 years ago, when the first 23 Jews came in 1654 from Recife, Brazil, to New Amsterdam, which is now called New York City, they were not welcomed by Governor Peter Stuyvesant, he of the peg leg. Nevertheless, they were allowed to stay, and some months later, one Asa Levy, one of the initial 23 Jewish immigrants, protested to Stuyvesant that Jews were not allowed to stand guard. According to Stuyvesant, the reason why he did not want a Jew to stand guard was because of the, quote, disinclination and unwillingness of local residents to serve as fellow soldiers with the Jewish nation and to be on guard with them in the same guardhouse. Levy insisted, however, that as a manual laborer, he should be able to stand guard like everyone else. Although initially thwarted, within 2 years, it took a while, Levy had succeeded in standing watch and ward just like everyone else. This was over 370 years ago, and that incident would have seemed to have been a good start for Jews being perceived as involved in America's military matters. This false perception of Jewish non-involvement was a sentiment expressed by the writer Mark Twain, who wrote in Harper's that the Jew is charged with the disinclination patriotically to stand by the flag as a soldier. By his make and ways, he is substantially a foreigner, and even the angels dislike foreigners. One wonders why that stupid statement came from Mark Twain, who used to appear on stage all over the country with Shalom Aleichem, the great Yiddish novelist. However, Mark Twain later recanted this false statement. It is unclear to me why this false perception that Jews do not serve still exists. The Israeli Defense Force is legendary, and the Jewish state of Israel has won all and is winning all its wars against much larger foes. The reality is that in addition to volunteering to guard New York City over 370 years ago, Jewish Americans have participated in all of America's wars, at least until the Vietnam War, in numbers proportionately greater than their percentage in the general population. For example, in World War I, Jews were 6% of the military and only 3% of the American population. In World War II, Jews were 4.23% of the military and only 3.6% of the American population. 18 Jews have received the Medal of Honor, and many more were denied because of anti-Semitism. I'm here today, too, as a prior JWV National Commander, to tell you that Jews have served their country from the get-go. Did you know, for example, that 50% of the first graduating class at West Point in 1902 were Jewish? 50%, half the class. Of course, there were only 2 cadets that graduated, and one was Simon Levy, who was Jewish. So we don't really brag too much about old Simon because, after all, he did finish last in his class. Now, I'd like to tell you a follow-up story of my being spat at when I returned from Vietnam. The lady missed, by the way. Several years ago, I was returning from work to my car, which was parked on a side street near my commuter rail stop. It had snowed that day, a wet snow, and I was worried that I'd gotten a ticket for parking in the street during an alleged snow emergency. Sure enough, there was wet paper under my windshield wiper. But I was relieved even before I took it off the windshield because I saw it was not that infamous, glowing orange color. It was not a parking ticket, but rather this was an unsigned note which said in part, quote, "I hope this makes your day. Thank you for your service." Now, I have a veteran's license plate, which, by the way, has saved me many a ticket. And obviously the writer of the note had seen it. This belated, wet welcome home was markedly different from the other wet welcome home I had received over 43 years earlier at the San Francisco airport. However late the message on this note may have been, this welcome home was deeply appreciated by me. You know, of course, that when thanking a Vietnam veteran, you add the words welcome home after thank you for your service, and the reason is obvious. So I'd like to show you some memorabilia and tell you a couple of other stories. I brought some memorabilia. In front of me is a captured Viet Cong flag. I was not on the operation that captured this flag. It was given to me by the Vietnamese, and actually they had given me 2, and one of them is in the museum in Washington. Second thing I'd like to show you is this cup. This cup is made out of a 105 howitzer shell, and it's a gift from my American advisory team when I left Vietnam. It's odd, they say that the 105 howitzer shell is supposed to have been shot in our province, but there's no artillery. There was no artillery in our province, so I think that's a bit of a fiction. Now, I was required to chug this 105 cup worth of Ba Mui Ba 33 beer. I could not have left Vietnam without having done that, and I did that successfully. Now it would take me a month to do it. I'm going to show you some books. In this particular book, which is a memoir of my hoochmate, John Rasky, you'll see a photo of the province senior advisor, Lieutenant Colonel, giving me this particular cup. You will not see a photo of me chugging the Bamui Bar Beer in it. I had thought about bringing a vase that was given to me as a parting gift by Hong Kim Ba, who was my interpreter, but I didn't bring it because it's falling apart. He gave me two vases. One of the vases is in that museum, and the gift from my actual Vietnamese counterpart hangs in that museum as well in Washington, D.C. Now, there are at least two books from the small advisory team in my province. The first is, and I am a minor but important character in each book. The first is called A Dragon Lives Forever. This is the second edition by the late Thomas R. Hargrove. He was the agricultural advisor in our province, and his story tells of his time there. There's a photo of me inoculating chickens and hens against Newcastle disease. I learned a lot from this West Texas cotton farmer. The second book, which I showed you, is about from my hoochmate, John Rasky, and it's his year in Vietnam, and it's a terrific book. I recommend it. In fact, I reviewed it positively for a journal called Vietnam Veterans of America, and I admitted my bias in that review. I want to tell you a little bit about my Bronze Star, because it has in there basically what I did for the year, although it's in obviously exaggerated form, and it really tells what I did in Vietnam. Now, this is not the Bronze Star for Valor. I did nothing heroic or nothing that deserved the Bronze Star of Valor. This is the Bronze Star for meritorious service in a combat zone, and there's no heroism involved. United States Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, and that's the unit I was in. I was in the what's called MACV, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. By direction of the President, the Bronze Star Medal is presented to Captain Harvey Weiner, U.S. Army, for distinguishing himself by meritorious service in connection with military operations against a hostile force during the period May 1969 to April 1970, while serving as the Deputy Phoenix Coordinator and later as the Phoenix Coordinator, Trung Tin Province, Republic of Vietnam. The Province Intelligence and Operations Coordinating Center was greatly influenced by his efforts, and its intelligence collections and operations capacity were significantly improved. Captain Weiner's relationship with and advice to his counterpart were outstanding, and a level of cooperation was received that was unparalleled in the province effort. It was chiefly through his efforts that the program initiated a successful psychological operations program for inducing neutralizations in the province. He was most influential in directing the improvement of all district advisory efforts in the Phoenix program. He accompanied provincial forces on numerous combat operations, I would say a few combat operations, often with small raid forces, and always displayed courage and professional skill under hostile fire. Captain Weiner's performance of duty was in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Army and reflects great credit upon himself in military service. Going back to when I said that my year in Vietnam had some great end results and repercussions later in life, it turns out that we reconnected 20 years ago the Americans in our advisory team. Through the efforts of one member, he was able to get over 100 of our teammates that served in over a 9-year period in our particular province on our team. And we have had reunions a year. A month ago, we had our 9th reunion, and this shirt and this hat shows the reunions of Advisory Team 58//73, which is our reunion team's number. And I want to read you something. This is, I do reviews, as I said, for a veterans organization called Vietnam Veterans of America. And one book I reviewed is called Voices from Vietnam, which I also highly recommend. And I thought I'd read for you a short essay entitled These Good Men by Michael Norman, also a Vietnam veteran. I now know why men who have been to war yearn to unite. Not to tell stories or to look at old pictures, not to laugh or weep. Comrades gather because they long to be with men who once acted their best, men who suffered and sacrificed, who were stripped raw right down to their humanity. I did not pick these men. They were delivered by fate, but I know them in a way I know no other men. I have never given anyone such trust. They were willing to guard something more precious than my life. They would have carried my reputation, the memory of me. It was part of the bargain we all made, the reason we are willing and were willing to die for one another. I cannot say where we are headed. Ours are not perfect friendships. Those are the province of legend and of myth. A few of my comrades drift far from me now, sending back only occasional word. I know that one day, even these will fall into silence. Some of the men will stay close, a couple perhaps always at hand. So as long as I have memory, I will think of them every day. I am sure that when I leave this world, my last thought will be of my family and of my comrades. Such good men.